what did the wife of the man who built Auschwitz actually do with her mornings? While Heinrich Himmler signed the paperwork of genocide in Berlin, his wife Margarete was 300 miles away in a lakeside villa in Bavaria, worrying about egg prices, homeopathic remedies, and whether the gardener had finished with the roses. It sounds almost absurd to say it that plainly, but that is exactly the texture of the life revealed in the hundreds of letters and diary pages that eventually surfaced from the Himmler household. A paper trail so complete that historians have called it unlike anything left behind by any other member of the Nazi leadership. Margarete Himmler was not a glamorous figure. She was not photographed at galas the way Emmy Goring was, and she did not host the kind of infamous parties associated with other wives of the regime's inner circle. She was, by most contemporary accounts, an unremarkable woman living what she believed to be a remarkably ordinary life. A life of poultry farming, Red Cross paperwork, homeopathic tinctures, and long stretches of loneliness in a mountain house, while her husband built the machinery of the Holocaust 2 rooms away from his office desk. So what did Margarete Himmler actually do all day? How did the wife of the Reichsführer SS fill the hours, the years, the decades of a marriage that began with mutual admiration and ended in near total estrangement, all while the world around her collapsed into war and atrocity? In this video, we are going to walk through her days almost hour by hour, using her own diary entries, her own letters, and the testimony of those who knew her to reconstruct what an ordinary day looked like for one of the most extraordinary women in the history of the Third Reich. So, without further ado, let's start at the beginning. Margarete Boden was born on the 9th of September 1893 in the small settlement of Gonkarzewo near Bromberg, a town in what was then the German province of Posen, and is today the Polish city of Bydgoszcz. She was the daughter of a landowner named Hans Boden and his wife Elfriede, born Pop, and she grew up as one of several siblings in a household of modest rural comfort. In 1909, at the age of 16, she attended the Höhere Tochterschule in Bromberg, a higher school for girls that would have given her the kind of genteel education expected of a daughter from a landowning family. But Margaret's real education came a few years later when the First World War broke out and she trained as a nurse. It was during those war years that Margarete developed what would become a lifelong preoccupation, an interest in nursing, homeopathy, and what she and many of her contemporaries called natural healing, an alternative to what she saw as the cold mechanics of conventional medicine. After the war ended, she took a position at a German Red Cross hospital, and it was this same institution, the Red Cross, that would resurface again and again throughout her life, an anchor of purpose in a marriage that would otherwise leave her with very little to do. Margaret's first marriage, contracted sometime after the war, was brief and produced no children. What it did produce, indirectly, was capital. With financial support from her father, Margarete was able to purchase a stake in a private nursing clinic in Berlin, which she operated and helped direct for several years. She was, by the standards of the time, an independent professional woman, someone who had built a small business, rather than simply waiting for a second marriage to define her. She distrusted much of conventional allopathic medicine, leaning instead on hypnosis, herbal preparations, and the old country remedies that she had likely absorbed growing up on a rural estate. It was a set of interests that, curiously, would align almost perfectly with the obsessions of the young man she was about to meet. A man 8 years her junior who was equally suspicious of modern pharmaceuticals and equally infatuated with the idea of returning Germans to a simpler, more disciplined, more agrarian existence. That man was Heinrich Himmler, and the two crossed paths in 1927 during one of his lecture tours, at a moment when he was rising through the ranks of the still small National Socialist movement as a district leader in Lower Bavaria and a close associate of Adolf Hitler. What began as an introduction blossomed into an intense written correspondence. In one surviving letter, Margarete referred to Himmler as a Landsknecht with a hard heart, a reference to the mercenary soldiers of early modern Germany, but she was nevertheless captivated by his romantic prose and by what appeared to be his genuine devotion to her. For his part, Himmler was drawn to her immediately. She was blonde, blue-eyed, 7 years his senior, and by his own later account to a party colleague, she was the first woman with whom he had ever had a sexual relationship. Whatever else one wants to say about the coldness that would come to define their later marriage, the early letters between Heinrich and Margarete read as genuinely infatuated, filled with pet names, private jokes, and half-serious pacts about diet and exercise that the couple made with each other as though they were already an old married pair. There were obstacles. Himmler's family was Catholic and conservative, and they were uneasy about their son marrying a Protestant woman who was older than him and who had already been married once before. Margarete, for her part, had to weigh the practicalities of abandoning a functioning business in Berlin, a city Himmler privately regarded as a den of moral decadence, in favour of a life built around his ideological obsessions with land, blood, and rural self-sufficiency. Eventually, his family grudgingly accepted her, and the couple married on the 3rd of July 1928 in Munich. It was a modest wedding for a man who would go on to command an empire of terror, and at the time of the marriage, Himmler was not yet the figure of dread he would later become. He had only just been appointed deputy leader of the SS, an organisation that in 1928 numbered perhaps a few hundred men, and functioned mostly as Adolf Hitler's personal bodyguard unit. So what did a day look like for the newly married Margarete Himmler? It looked, first and foremost, like farm labour. Margarete sold her share of the Berlin clinic and used the proceeds to help finance a plot of land in Waldtrudering, a rural area near Munich, where the couple erected a prefabricated house and set about trying to raise poultry for market. This was not a hobby farm for weekend recreation. It was intended as a genuine income-generating enterprise, one built on the same back-to-the-land ideology that animated much of early Nazi rhetoric about German blood and German soil. Himmler, however, was constantly absent, consumed by party business, leaving Margarete to manage the practical, exhausting work of raising livestock largely on her own. Her mornings would have started early, tending chickens, dealing with feed suppliers, negotiating with buyers, and keeping the ledgers that recorded a business that was, by most accounts, mostly unsuccessful. Her letters from this period reveal a woman who was frequently exasperated, both by the physical toll of the work and by the anti-Semitic conspiracy theories she had absorbed from her husband and evidently made her own. In one letter concerning her difficulties selling eggs, she complained bitterly about Jewish traders, language that mirrored almost exactly the rhetoric Himmler used in his own correspondence back to her. A reminder that whatever else Margarete's marriage lacked in companionship, it did not lack in ideological alignment. On the 8th of August, 1929, Margarete gave birth to the couple's only biological daughter, Gudrun, whom they nicknamed Puppy, meaning dolly. The birth came just months after Himmler had been appointed Reichsführer SS in January of that year, taking command of an organisation that would soon grow from a few hundred men into the central instrument of Nazi terror. For Margarete, motherhood added an entirely new dimension to her daily routine, one that blended childcare with the ongoing demands of the failing poultry operation and, increasingly, with a growing sense of isolation as her husband's political star rose and his physical presence in the household correspondingly diminished. Gudrun would become the emotional centre of Margarete's life for the next 4 decades, a bond that outlasted the marriage, outlasted the war, and outlasted the disintegration of the world the family had built together. The failure of the Waldtrudering poultry venture deserves a slightly fuller accounting since it illustrates just how precarious Margarete's early married life actually was before Himmler's political fortunes transformed the family's circumstances entirely. The couple had invested a substantial portion of the proceeds from Margarete's Berlin clinic into the enterprise, purchasing land, building materials and breeding stock in the hope of establishing a self-sufficient rural household that would generate meaningful income independent of Himmler's uncertain and largely unpaid political activities in the still fringe Nazi movement of the late 1920s. The reality proved far harder than the romantic ideology of back-to-the-land living that had inspired the venture in the first place. Poultry farming required constant, skilled attention that Margarete alone, however dedicated, could not always provide given the scale of the operation the couple had envisioned, and the business never achieved the profitability the couple had hoped for. Correspondence from these years reveals a marriage under real financial strain, with Margarete increasingly shouldering both the physical labour and the administrative anxiety of a failing business, while her husband remained largely absent, consumed by party organising work that paid little and promised even less in the way of immediate security. It was, in hindsight, a strange and precarious foundation for a marriage that would eventually place its participants at the very centre of one of history's most powerful and murderous regimes. But for Margarete living through it in real time, the early 1930s must have felt considerably more uncertain than the eventual outcome would suggest. A young household teetering on the edge of financial failure, with no guarantee whatsoever that Himmler's political gamble would ever pay off. By 1932, the poultry farm experiment had run its course, and Himmler sold the property, moving the family into an apartment close to Hitler's own residence in Munich. It was around this time, in 1933, that the couple adopted a young boy named Gerhard, the son of an SS officer named Kurt von der Ahe, who had been killed earlier that year. Gerhard's arrival added a third child to the household, though by most accounts he received considerably less attention from Himmler than his biological daughter did. A pattern that would persist throughout the family's history and that would leave Gerhard in later decades feeling like something of an afterthought in the Himmler household. 1934 brought the change that would define the rest of Margarete's domestic life. Himmler purchased a large villa in Gmund am Tegernsee, a picturesque lake town in the mountains southeast of Munich, a property that had originally been built in 1892 and had passed through the hands of opera singers and private citizens before falling into Nazi ownership. The house, known as Lindenfecht, sat on more than 20,000 square metres of land, and it was here, rather than in Berlin or Munich, that Margarete would establish the closest thing she had to a permanent home for the rest of her married life. With her husband perpetually absent on party and later SS business, Margarete effectively became the sole day-to-day administrator of the Gmund household, raising Gudrun, overseeing staff, managing the grounds and constructing a domestic routine almost entirely independent of her husband's presence. What did that routine actually look like? Based on her surviving diary, it was a life measured in small, almost tedious increments. Notes on the weather, notes on which relatives were visiting, notes on whether the household had enough coal or enough vegetables, notes on Gudrun's schooling and health. Margarete's diary is not, for the most part, a document of political reflection. It is a document of domestic management, written by a woman whose horizon rarely extended past her own garden fence, even as her husband's decisions were reshaping the map of Europe. She continued to practice the homeopathic and herbal remedies she had studied years earlier, treating the family's minor ailments with tinctures and natural preparations rather than conventional medicine, in keeping with both her own convictions and Himmler's well-documented suspicion of pharmaceuticals. She oversaw a household staff, managed a substantial garden and grounds, and increasingly took on a supervisory role among the wives of other senior SS officers, who had also relocated their families to the Tegernsee Valley after the Nazis seized power in 1933. A cluster of villas that turned the quiet lakeside community into an unofficial satellite of the regime's upper echelons. Seasonal rituals like Christmas also occupied a disproportionately large share of Margarete's planning and correspondence throughout the 1930s and into the war years, offering another window into how thoroughly the ordinary rhythms of family life persisted alongside the family's deepening entanglement with the regime's crimes. Himmler took a particular, almost fussy interest in the details of Gudrun's Christmas wish lists even from a distance, writing to Margarete with specific instructions about gifts to procure and traditions to observe, instructions that Margarete then had to translate into the practical work of shopping, wrapping and organising a household celebration, often without her husband physically present to share in it. The Nazi regime had, of course, its own fraught and ideologically loaded relationship with the Christian holiday, promoting various pseudo-pagan reinterpretations of Christmas designed to strip the celebration of what the party considered its excessively Judeo-Christian character. And it is likely that the Himmler household's own observance of the holiday reflected at least some of this ideological reworking, blending traditional German Christmas customs with the regime's broader project of reshaping every corner of private life, however intimate, to fit its racial and cultural vision. For Margarete, tasked with actually executing these celebrations year after year, the holiday represented one more item on an already long list of domestic responsibilities that carried far more ideological weight than their surface cheerfulness might suggest. Margarete had joined the Nazi Party in 1928, the same year she married Himmler, and her party membership was far from a symbolic formality. She regularly organised gatherings for the wives of high-ranking SS leaders, a kind of informal social apparatus that mirrored in miniature the hierarchical structures her husband was busy building within the SS itself. Yet by nearly every account that survives, Margarete was not well liked among this circle of women. She had a reputation for being cold, demanding, and humourless, and during a Nuremberg party rally in 1938, tensions boiled over into open conflict when the other wives collectively refused to accept her attempts to direct their activities. Gebhard Himmler, Heinrich's own brother, later described Margarete as a cool, hard woman with extremely delicate nerves, someone who radiated no warmth whatsoever and who spent a great deal of time complaining, though he grudgingly conceded that she had nonetheless been what he called an exemplary housewife, devoted to her husband and unwavering in her loyalty to him despite the obvious strain in their relationship. Lena Heydrich, wife of Himmler's feared subordinate Reinhard Heydrich, was crueler still in her assessment, reportedly mocking Margarete's physical appearance in terms that were as unkind as they were memorable. The American journalist Bella Fromm, who observed the couple at a social occasion in July 1937, described Himmler's wife in equally unflattering terms, noting her plain, heavy-set appearance and the couple's evident enthusiasm for the pleasures of the dinner table. None of this cruelty seemed to trouble Margarete particularly. She had never sought popularity among Berlin society, and her sense of purpose seemed to come less from social acceptance than from the conviction that she was building something solid and permanent at Gmund, a household run on discipline, self-sufficiency, and what she and her husband both regarded as authentically German values. The specific conflict at the 1938 Nuremberg rally is worth dwelling on a little further, since it captures so precisely the particular kind of social friction that defined Margarete's standing among her peers. As the wife of the Reichsführer SS, Margarete would have expected, by the ordinary logic of hierarchy that structured every other aspect of the Nazi movement, to occupy a position of natural precedence among the assembled wives of senior party and SS officials gathered for the rally's festivities. Instead, according to accounts of the episode, the other women simply refused to defer to her, declining to follow her lead in whatever coordinated activity or seating arrangement she had attempted to organise. A small but telling act of collective social resistance against a woman whose personality had evidently alienated her peers, regardless of her husband's formal rank. For Margarete, who took her position and its associated obligations seriously, the episode must have been a humiliating reminder that institutional power did not automatically translate into personal respect, a lesson that seems to have done little to soften her subsequent approach to the SS wives' social circle in the years that followed. It is worth pausing here to ask what exactly filled Margarete's calendar during these mid-1930s years at Gmund, because the answer illuminates just how thoroughly her identity had become fused with the regime's broader propaganda about idealized German womanhood. Her mornings typically began with household management, instructions to domestic staff, oversight of meal preparation built around the family's homeopathic and dietary preferences, and correspondence, endless correspondence, both with her husband, who wrote to her with surprising regularity given his workload, and with Gudrun's teachers and various relatives. Afternoons were often devoted to the grounds themselves, tending a substantial vegetable garden and overseeing the small-scale animal husbandry that the family maintained even after abandoning the commercial poultry operation of their Waldtrudering years. Margarete took genuine pride in this kind of physical, practical labour, viewing it as an extension of the same back-to-the-land philosophy that had first drawn her and Himmler together in 1927. Evenings, when Himmler was present, which was rare, were spent in quiet domesticity. When he was absent, which was the overwhelming majority of the time, Margarete filled the hours with letters, with visits from Himmler's sisters and other relatives, and with the low hum of anxiety that seems to run through so much of her diary. Anxiety about money, about her husband's health, about Gudrun's future, and increasingly, as the decade wore on, about the darkening character of the regime her family was now inextricably bound to. The darkening was not something Margarete resisted. Quite the opposite. Her diary and letters from these years are laced with the same casual, deeply internalized anti-Semitism that characterized her husband's worldview, expressed not in the language of policy or ideology, but in the mundane vocabulary of domestic complaint, the same register she used to grumble about weather or household expenses. On the 9th of November 1938, the eve of the night that would become known as Kristallnacht, Margarete recorded in her diary a wish that what she called the Jewish problem would simply disappear, A chilling entry made all the more chilling by its placement, alongside entirely unremarkable notes about domestic life. It was not a statement of policy, because Margarete held no policy-making power of any kind. It was simply the unfiltered thought of a woman who had absorbed the ambient hatred of her environment so completely that it had become part of the texture of her everyday thinking. No more remarkable to her, apparently, than a complaint about the price of eggs. By the late 1930s, Margarete's daily existence had settled into a rhythm that would remain largely unchanged, in its broad outlines if not its specific content, for the remainder of the Nazi period. Solitary household management at Gmund, punctuated by visits from relatives, sporadic and increasingly brief visits from her husband, correspondence that ranged from the deeply personal to the numbingly administrative, and an ever-present undercurrent of the regime's racial ideology running through even her most ordinary observations. She was, by this point, thoroughly enmeshed in the machinery of the Third Reich, not as a policymaker or a perpetrator in any direct sense, but as a domestic administrator whose entire adult identity had been built around supporting, materially and ideologically, the career of the man who would become one of the chief architects of the Holocaust. What she could not have known in these relatively quiet years before the outbreak of war was just how directly her own routine was about to be pulled into the machinery of occupation and atrocity, as the German Red Cross, the institution that had given her purpose since her nursing days in the First World War, prepared to send her east into the heart of occupied Poland. Before we follow Margarete into the war years, it is worth lingering a little longer on the physical world she inhabited at Gmund, because the setting itself tells us a great deal about what her days actually looked like. Lindenficht sat above the Tegernsee, a long alpine lake ringed by forested hills in a valley that had become something of a fashionable retreat for Munich's professional classes since the turn of the century, home at various points to opera singers, painters, and wealthy private citizens before the Nazis arrived and transformed it into an unofficial company town for the SS leadership. The house itself, built in 1892, had been extended and altered under Himmler's ownership, gaining new wings and outbuildings suited to a family that increasingly needed room for domestic staff, for visiting officials, and eventually, in the war's final year, for a bunker constructed on the grounds, a stark structural reminder of just how the war would eventually intrude, even on this quiet mountain refuge. For most of the 1930s, though, the estate functioned as exactly what Margarete wanted it to be, a self-contained rural household where she could exercise near-total control over the family's daily rhythms, free from the scrutiny of Berlin society and the constant political manoeuvring that consumed her husband's attention. Margarete's relationship with her own extended family also shaped the daily rhythms of the Gmund household in ways worth noting. Her sisters, Elfriede, Lydia and Paula, remained part of her life throughout the 1930s, visiting Gmund periodically and providing Margarete with a support network largely independent of her husband's own family and political circle. It was notably her sister Lydia who would eventually take Margarete in during the difficult years after the war, a bond of sisterly loyalty that outlasted the collapse of the Nazi regime and the total upheaval of Margarete's material circumstances. Himmler's own sisters, too, are recorded in Margarete's diary as regular visitors to Gmund, suggesting that despite the religious and generational friction that had initially complicated the marriage, the two families had by the mid-1930s settled into a workable, if not especially warm, relationship, centered on shared holidays, birthdays, and the ordinary rituals of extended family life. This network of relatives, aunts, sisters, cousins moving in and out of the Gmund household gave Margarete's daily existence a social texture that her strained marriage alone could not have provided, a reminder that even amid the isolation of her situation, she was rarely entirely alone. Adolf Hitler himself had played a quiet but real role in facilitating the Himmler marriage in the first place, socializing with the couple during their courtship, and according to several accounts, standing as an informal patron of the match. He would later serve as godfather to the couple's daughter Gudrun, born in 1929, a role that speaks to just how tightly the personal lives of the Nazi leadership had already become intertwined with the party's public image by the end of the 1920s. For Margarete, this meant that even her most private domestic decisions, the choice of a name for her daughter, the christening arrangements, the selection of godparents, carried an unavoidable political dimension. Nothing about being Heinrich Himmler's wife could remain purely personal, even when Margarete herself seemed to want nothing more than an ordinary rural existence centered on her garden, her chickens, and her daughter. That daughter, meanwhile, was becoming the object of an attention from her father that Margarete herself rarely received. Himmler, though frequently absent, maintained an almost obsessive correspondence with Gudrun, telephoning her every few days when circumstances allowed and visiting as often as his schedule permitted, always eager to hear about her schooling, her health, and her activities. He nicknamed her Puppy and treated her, by all accounts, with a warmth and tenderness that stood in jarring contrast to the industrial cruelty he was simultaneously overseeing within the SS and the concentration camp system. Margarete, for her part, seems to have accepted this dynamic without complaint, perhaps because Gudrun's happiness was itself a central pillar of her own daily purpose. Or perhaps because, after years of marriage, she had simply learned not to expect from her husband the kind of emotional attention that he reserved almost exclusively for his daughter, and eventually for a young secretary in his Berlin office. Margaret's homeopathic convictions, meanwhile, continued to shape the practical texture of family life at Gmund throughout these years. She dosed the household's minor ailments with herbal tinctures rather than pharmaceutical remedies. She favoured what she considered natural, unprocessed foods, and she maintained a broader philosophy of physical self-discipline that dovetailed neatly with her husband's own well-documented obsessions with diet, fitness, and what the Nazi regime euphemistically called racial hygiene. Whether this made for a genuinely healthier household is impossible to say, but it does tell us something important about how Margarete filled her days, not merely as a passive homemaker executing someone else's instructions, but as an active practitioner of a specific, considered philosophy of domestic life, one she had developed over years of nursing training and clinical experience before she ever met Heinrich Himmler. In this sense, her daily labour at Gmund was not simply drudgery imposed upon her by an absent husband. It was, at least in her own mind, the fulfilment of a genuine vocation, however thoroughly that vocation had become entangled with the darkest ideology of the 20th century. The wives of the Tegernsee Valley, meanwhile, formed their own small, tense social ecosystem, one in which Margarete occupied an uneasy position of nominal seniority, undermined by widespread personal dislike. She organised teas, luncheons, and charitable gatherings in her capacity as the Reichsführer's wife, activities that were expected of a woman in her position, but that seemed to have brought her little genuine satisfaction. Visitors to Gmund during these years described a household that ran with almost military precision. Meals served on schedule, staff drilled in specific routines, the garden maintained with an intensity that bordered on obsession, all of it presided over by a woman who seemed happiest, not in the drawing room entertaining guests, but out among the vegetable beds or the chicken runs doing physical work with her own hands. It was, in its way, a peculiar inversion of the traditional aristocratic household, run by a woman who found more comfort in labour than in leisure, and who seemed to derive her sense of identity and worth almost entirely from the visible, tangible results of her own daily industry. By the time Europe stood on the brink of war in the late summer of 1939, Margarete Himmler had spent more than a decade constructing this particular kind of life, a life built around domestic self-sufficiency, ideological conformity, and an almost total substitution of practical labour for emotional intimacy with her husband. It had not made her happy exactly, but it had given her purpose, structure, and a sense of control that she might otherwise have lacked in a marriage defined by her husband's near-total absorption in his political career. That structure was about to be tested in ways Margarete could scarcely have imagined, as the outbreak of war drew her out of the Gmund household and back into the institutional world of the German Red Cross, sending her on missions into territories where the consequences of her husband's ideology were no longer abstract, but horrifyingly physically present. If we try to reconstruct a single composite day at Gmund during these pre-war years, drawing on the fragments that survive in Margarete's diary and correspondence, it might look something like this. She rose early, likely before the household staff, and spent the first hour or two of the morning attending to correspondence, letters to Heinrich when he was travelling, letters to relatives, letters concerning Gudrun's education. Breakfast was simple and, in keeping with the family's dietary convictions, largely free of the processed foods that both Himmlers distrusted. The middle of the morning was typically given over to household administration, instructions to staff, oversight of provisions, and the kind of bookkeeping that any rural estate of this size demanded. Afternoons varied by season, but frequently involved physical work in the garden or among the animals, work that Margarete appears to have genuinely enjoyed, despite, or perhaps because of, its demanding nature. Visitors, when they came, tended to be family rather than friends, Himmler's sisters, occasional cousins, and later, as the decade wore on, a rotating cast of SS wives whose husbands had also relocated their families to the valley. Evenings were quiet, often spent reading or continuing the endless correspondence that seems to have structured so much of Margaret's inner life. A woman who processed her isolation not through confrontation or complaint to her husband directly, but through the steady, private accumulation of written thought in her diary, a habit that would eventually leave historians an unusually intimate record of exactly how an unremarkable day felt to the wife of one of history's most notorious perpetrators. It is worth understanding, too, that Margaret's devotion to homeopathy and natural healing was not some eccentric personal quirk that happened to survive her marriage into the Nazi elite. It was, in fact, deeply compatible with strands of official Nazi thinking about health, race, and the body. The regime cultivated a broader cultural suspicion of what it characterized as Jewish-influenced modern medicine, promoting instead a vision of natural, biodynamic living rooted in soil, sunlight, and traditional remedies, a worldview that dovetailed with the party's romanticized vision of German peasant life and racial vitality. Rudolf Hess, Hitler's own deputy, was famously devoted to homeopathy and alternative medicine himself, going so far as to employ a personal homeopathic physician and to advocate for herbal remedies within his own household, a parallel that places Margaret's convictions squarely within a recognizable current of Nazi-era thought, rather than treating them as some isolated personal eccentricity. For Margarete, then, her daily practice of dosing the household with tinctures and avoiding conventional pharmaceuticals was not simply a matter of personal preference. It was an expression, however unconscious, of a broader ideological current that linked physical health, racial purity, and a rejection of urban cosmopolitan modernity. The same current that had drawn her and Himmler together over their shared distaste for what they considered the decadence of Berlin in the first place. The broader social world of the Tegernsee Valley during these years also deserves a closer look, because Margarete was far from the only wife of a senior Nazi official establishing a household in this particular corner of Bavaria. The valley's transformation into what amounted to an unofficial company town for the SS leadership meant that Margaret's daily social interactions, however strained, took place within a small, tightly wound community of women whose husbands wielded enormous and terrifying power. Women who were themselves engaged in the same project of constructing model National Socialist households, model in the sense that the regime's propaganda held them up, implicitly or explicitly, as templates for German domestic life more broadly. This was a peculiar kind of fishbowl existence, one in which every domestic decision, every social slight, every garden competently or incompetently tended, carried an added layer of political significance that women in less rarefied circumstances never had to contend with. Margaret's reputation for coldness and rigidity within this community may well have been exacerbated by the sheer pressure of operating within such a small, high-stakes social environment where reputational damage could carry consequences reaching all the way up to the men at the very top of the SS hierarchy. This, then, was the woman and the world that would soon be swept up in the vastly larger machinery of the Second World War. A household manager, a homeopathic practitioner, an unhappy but dutiful wife, and a committed anti-Semite whose prejudices were expressed not through grand political theorizing, but through the same mundane domestic vocabulary she used for everything else in her carefully ordered life. As Germany's tanks rolled into Poland in September 1939, Margarete Himmler's own personal war was about to begin as well. Not on the front lines, but in the offices and hospital wards of the German Red Cross, an institution that would soon place her, quite literally, on the ground in the occupied territories where her husband's ideology was being translated into mass death. When war broke out in September 1939, Margaret's Red Cross training, dormant for 2 decades, suddenly became relevant again in a way that reshaped her entire daily schedule. By December of that year, she had taken on supervisory responsibility for Red Cross hospitals across Military District 3, the administrative zone covering Berlin and Brandenburg, a position that came with real institutional weight and real day-to-day obligations. This was not an honorary title handed to her because of her husband's rank, although it certainly did not hurt. That she was married to the Reichsführer SS. It required Margarete to travel, to inspect facilities, to review staffing and supply issues, and eventually to oversee missions that took her into the newly occupied territories that the Wehrmacht had just conquered. For a woman who had spent the previous decade largely confined to a single rural estate, this represented an enormous expansion of her physical world, even as it placed her in ever closer proximity to the human consequences of her husband's genocidal policies. The clearest evidence of this proximity comes from March 1940, when Margarete's diary records a business trip into German-occupied Poland, taking her through Posen, through Lodz, and through Warsaw. What she saw there, and how she chose to describe it, offers one of the starkest windows we have into the mind of a woman who insisted, for the rest of her life, that she knew nothing of the crimes being committed in her husband's name. Her diary entries from the trip are laced with dehumanizing language about the Polish and Jewish populations she encountered. Descriptions that reduce entire communities to filth and disorder in need of German correction. She was, by her own written account, a direct eyewitness to the conditions being imposed on occupied Poland in the earliest phase of the Nazi occupation, conditions that would only worsen catastrophically in the years that followed as the ghettoization and eventual extermination of Polish Jewry accelerated. Whatever Margarete Himmler did or did not know about the specific administrative machinery of the Holocaust, her own diary makes it impossible to sustain the claim that she was simply a naive homemaker, insulated from the ideology her husband was busy turning into policy. She had seen the occupied territories with her own eyes, and what she recorded was not horror at the treatment of Poland's population, but casual, unreflective contempt. Her Red Cross service also earned her, according to several accounts, an honorary rank equivalent to colonel within the organization's hierarchy, a recognition of the volume and seniority of the work she had taken on. For Margarete, this professional advancement seems to have provided a genuine sense of purpose that her domestic life at Gmund, for all its careful order, could not fully supply. She was, after all, a trained nurse who had spent years running her own clinic before her marriage, and the wartime expansion of the Red Cross gave her an opportunity to exercise that professional identity again, on a far larger administrative scale than anything she had managed in Berlin during the 1920s. It is one of the more uncomfortable ironies of her biography that the same institutional structures that gave Margarete a renewed sense of competence and purpose during the war years were operating in direct service of an occupation whose brutality she had personally witnessed, and by her own diary's testimony, did not particularly regret. Back at Gmund, meanwhile, the rhythms of ordinary domestic life continued even as the war reshaped the wider world. Margarete still managed the household, still tended the garden, and still corresponded constantly with her husband, whose letters during this period read as a strange, almost surreal blend of tenderness and horror. Himmler wrote to her about sleeping well despite an exhausting workload, about a can of caviar he had left for her in the icebox, about his eagerness to fulfill Gudrun's Christmas wish list, all while conducting official business that included direct oversight of the concentration camp system and, increasingly, the machinery of mass murder. In one letter that has since become notorious among historians, Himmler informed his wife that he was off to Auschwitz, signing the note with kisses and the affectionate name Heini. A jarring juxtaposition that captures better than almost any historical analysis could just how thoroughly domesticated genocide had become within this particular household's daily correspondence. For Margarete, receiving such letters seems to have provoked no recorded crisis of conscience. They were simply more entries in an ongoing exchange about a husband's travels, no more remarkable in the texture of her responses than a note about the weather or Gudrun's latest school report. It was in 1941 that Margarete's domestic world was upended by a discovery that had nothing to do with the war and everything to do with the ordinary betrayals of a strained marriage. Himmler had, since roughly 1936, been growing close to a young secretary named Hedwig Potthast, and by 1938 the relationship had become a full affair. Potthast left her position in 1941, and it was around this same time that Margarete learned of the relationship. a discovery that formalized what had, in practical terms, already been true for years, that she and Heinrich were effectively separated in every sense except the legal and public one. Margaret's response was not confrontation or divorce. She chose instead to tolerate the arrangement, largely for the sake of Gudrun, whose relationship with her father remained close, and who Margaret apparently did not wish to disrupt through a public scandal or separation. Himmler would go on to father 2 children with Potthast, a son named Helga, born in 1942, and a daughter named Nanette Dorothea, born in 1944, and the existence of this second, secret family became one of the open, if unspoken, facts of Margaret's later married life. The emotional cost of this arrangement is difficult to measure from the surviving documents, since Margaret's diary tends toward the practical rather than the confessional, but the shift in Himmler's own letters to her offers a telling clue. Where his early correspondence had addressed her with the language of infatuation, his wartime letters increasingly settled into a warmer but more distant register, referring to her as "Dear Mommy," a term that positioned Margaret firmly in the role of household manager and mother of his acknowledged child rather than romantic partner. The letters kept coming, and Margaret kept answering them, maintaining the outward form of a functioning marriage even as its emotional substance had long since been hollowed out. What replaced romantic intimacy, for Margaret, appears to have been an even deeper investment in the practical, day-to-day rituals of household management. The garden, the animals, the correspondence, the Red Cross work, all of it functioning as a kind of scaffolding that held her daily existence together in the absence of any real partnership with her husband. Life at Gmund during the war years grew progressively harder, even for a family as well connected as the Himmlers. Rationing affected every German household to some degree, and while Margaret's position afforded her privileges unavailable to ordinary citizens, her diary and letters from this period nonetheless record persistent anxieties about shortages, about the difficulty of maintaining the household's usual standards, and about the shrinking pool of staff available to help run an estate that had once employed a fuller domestic complement. As German men were increasingly conscripted for military service, forced and coerced labour became a grim substitute on estates like Gmund, and by the final year of the war, a bunker had been constructed on the property, a structure in which, according to later accounts of the estate's history, a forced labourer died during its construction. A small but telling detail that illustrates how even the Himmler family's private domestic refuge had become entangled with the machinery of wartime coercion. The specific privations of wartime rationing deserve a slightly closer look, since they illustrate just how thoroughly the war eventually reshaped even a household as well connected as the Himmlers. German civilians faced increasingly strict rationing of food, fuel, clothing and household goods as the war progressed, a system administered through ration cards that dictated exactly how much bread, meat, fat and other staples a household could obtain in a given period. While Margaret's status undoubtedly afforded her access to supplementary goods unavailable to ordinary Germans, whether through official channels connected to her Red Cross role or through the informal privileges that came with her husband's position, her diary entries from the war's middle years nonetheless register genuine anxiety about supply shortages, about the difficulty of heating the Gmund house adequately through the harsh Bavarian winters as coal allocations tightened, and about maintaining the household's accustomed standard of living in the face of a wartime economy increasingly strained by the demands of a two-front war. These were not the anxieties of genuine deprivation of the kind experienced by millions of Germans in bombed-out cities, let alone the catastrophic suffering endured by the populations of occupied Poland and the Soviet Union under German rule, but they were real anxieties nonetheless, and they occupy a disproportionate share of Margaret's wartime diary compared to any sustained reflection on the war's broader human cost. Family outings during this period retained an unsettling normalcy that is perhaps the single most disturbing feature of the entire Himmler household's wartime existence. Gudrun's own diary, kept separately from her mother's, records a family visit to the Dachau concentration camp, an outing she described in the same breathless, enthusiastic tone a child might use to describe a trip to a museum or a botanical garden, noting the gardening work done by prisoners, admiring paintings the inmates had produced, and remarking afterward on how pleasant the meal had been that followed the visit. Margaret's own attitude towards such outings is not separately documented in as much detail, but there is no indication anywhere in the surviving record that she regarded a family visit to a concentration camp as anything other than an ordinary excursion, one more entry in the calendar of a household whose entire adult members had, by this point in the war, normalized proximity to the machinery of persecution to a degree that is almost impossible for us to fully absorb today. As the war ground on into its middle years, Margaret's daily concerns increasingly came to mirror those of millions of other German mothers, even as her husband's role in the war effort grew ever more monstrous. She worried about the safety of her adopted son Gerhard, who would eventually join the SS himself in the war's final chaotic months. She worried about supply shortages, about the increasing risk of Allied bombing raids reaching even a relatively remote lakeside town like Gmund, and about the steadily worsening military situation on both the eastern and western fronts. She continued her Red Cross duties, continued her homeopathic practice, continued tending the garden that had become, by this point, almost a form of psychological refuge from a war whose true scale and horror she seems to have processed only in the most narrow, self-interested terms. Whatever fear she felt about the future was, by every surviving account, fear for her own family's safety and comfort rather than any dawning recognition of the scale of the catastrophe her husband was orchestrating. What did a wartime day actually look like for Margarete once her Red Cross responsibilities expanded alongside her domestic duties at Gmund? The answer involves a surprising amount of travel for a woman who had spent much of the previous decade rooted to a single rural estate. She would often begin the day reviewing correspondence related to hospital administration, checking on supply requisitions, staffing reports, and the general condition of facilities under her supervision in the Berlin-Brandenburg district. When her schedule required inspection visits, she travelled by car or train, dressed in the practical uniform of a senior Red Cross official, moving through a wartime transportation network that was itself increasingly strained by fuel shortages and bombing damage. These were not ceremonial visits. Contemporary accounts describe Margarete as someone who took her institutional responsibilities seriously, someone who wanted to see conditions for herself rather than simply reviewing paperwork from the comfort of her Gmund study. This same instinct toward direct hands-on verification is presumably what took her into occupied Poland in March 1940, and it likely explains other, less thoroughly documented trips she made into additional occupied territories over the following years, as her Red Cross portfolio expanded alongside the ever-widening scope of German military occupation across the continent. Evenings, when Margarete was home rather than travelling, retained much of their pre-war character. Correspondence with Heinrich, oversight of Gudrun's schooling, and increasingly as the girl entered her teenage years, her budding political consciousness and devotion to her father's cause, and the ongoing management of a household now operating under the strain of wartime rationing and staff shortages. Margaret's diary from these years shows a woman juggling an unusual combination of roles: senior wartime administrator, homeopathic health practitioner, estate manager, and increasingly isolated wife, all while maintaining an unwavering ideological commitment to the regime that had structured her entire adult life. It is a combination that resists easy categorization. She was neither a passive victim of her husband's crimes nor an active architect of them in any operational sense, but rather something in between. A committed believer who benefited enormously from her proximity to power while insisting, both to herself and later to Allied interrogators, that this proximity had somehow left her ignorant of what that power was actually being used to accomplish. Her relationship with her daughter deepened considerably during these years, in ways that would have lasting consequences for both women's post-war lives. Gudrun, entering adolescence amid the psychological pressure of being the Reichsführer's daughter, absorbed her father's ideology with an intensity that would define the rest of her own long life. And Margarete, whether through genuine conviction or simple maternal indulgence, did nothing to discourage this devotion. If anything, the shared bond between mother and daughter, both devoted to the same absent, all-powerful father figure, seems to have deepened as the war progressed, and as Margaret's own marriage to Heinrich grew ever more distant in every respect but the formal one. The two women would remain each other's closest confidants for the rest of their lives, bound together by a shared loyalty to Heinrich Himmler that neither the revelations of the Holocaust nor decades of post-war scrutiny would ever fully dislodge. It is worth pausing here to place Margaret's Red Cross role within its broader wartime context, because the German Red Cross during the Nazi era was not the politically neutral humanitarian organization its name might suggest to a modern audience. By the outbreak of war, the organization had been thoroughly absorbed into the machinery of the state, its leadership structure aligned with party priorities, and its operations increasingly subordinated to military and, at times, racial policy objectives. Serving as a senior Red Cross administrator in wartime Germany meant serving an institution that, whatever the genuine medical needs it addressed for wounded soldiers, operated within an ideological framework that drew sharp, often lethal distinctions between those deemed worthy of care and those the regime had marked for persecution or death. Margaret's advancement within this system, culminating in her honorary rank equivalent to colonel, reflected both her genuine professional competence, honed over decades since her first nursing training during the First World War, and the undeniable advantages that came from being married to the man who, by 1943, held direct authority over the police, the SS, and eventually the entire Reich's internal administration. It would be a mistake to view her Red Cross career as existing in some separate, apolitical compartment from her husband's genocidal activities. The two were, in the structure of the Nazi state, deeply and inextricably intertwined. Compare for a moment Margaret's wartime routine to that of other senior wives within the Nazi hierarchy who have featured in our previous videos. Emmy Goring, married to the Luftwaffe chief Heinrich Goring, spent much of the war years cultivating her self-appointed role as the unofficial First Lady of the Third Reich, hosting lavish functions and enjoying a lifestyle built on the confiscated wealth of the regime's victims, a public performative existence almost entirely opposite to Margaret's preference for private, hands-on domestic labour. Lena Heydrich, wife of the Reich's security chief Reinhard Heydrich, ran an even more directly exploitative household, employing forced labourers on her Bohemian estate under conditions that later investigations characterised as physically abusive. Margaret's own household at Gmünd likewise depended, by the war's final year, on coerced labour for its construction projects. A grim point of convergence between women whose personalities and social standing otherwise differed enormously. What unites all three of these very different domestic lives, despite their surface variations in taste, temperament, and social ambition, is the underlying reality that each woman's comfortable, orderly daily existence was purchased directly or indirectly through the machinery of a genocidal state, whether that machinery manifested as confiscated art hanging on Emmy Goring's walls, forced labourers toiling on Lena Heydrich's Bohemian estate, or a Red Cross administrative position that placed Margarete Himmler in direct, documented contact with the human wreckage of German occupation policy in Poland. Hedwig Potthast, the woman at the centre of the affair that reshaped Margaret's marriage after 1941, deserves a brief accounting of her own, if only because her presence so thoroughly reorganised the emotional architecture of Margaret's daily life from that point forward. Potthast had joined Himmler's personal staff as a secretary in the mid-1930s, and by the time their relationship deepened into a full affair around 1938, she had become an increasingly permanent fixture in Himmler's professional orbit, eventually leaving her official position altogether in 1941 as the relationship solidified into what amounted to a fully parallel domestic arrangement, complete with its own household and, eventually, its own children. Himmler reportedly viewed the arrangement through the lens of his own peculiar ideological convictions about population growth and Aryan reproduction, framing what was in essence a straightforward extramarital affair in the pseudo-scientific language of demographic duty that characterized so much of Nazi racial ideology. For Margaret, the practical consequence of all this was a marriage that continued in form, letters still arriving, financial support still flowing, the appearance of a functioning household still maintained for Gudrun's sake, while its emotional core had been relocated entirely to a household she was not part of and, evidently, chose not to challenge directly. The stylistic evolution of Margaret's own letters across these years also tells its own quiet story. Her earliest correspondence with Himmler, dating back to their 1927 courtship, is warm, occasionally playful, and clearly written by a woman genuinely invested in the emotional success of a new relationship. By the middle years of the war, that warmth had given way almost entirely to a flatter, more administrative register, letters that read less like communications between intimate partners and more like status reports exchanged between two people managing a shared, increasingly distant enterprise. This shift mirrors, in miniature, the broader trajectory of the marriage itself. An initial period of genuine mutual attraction giving way, over the better part of 2 decades, to a functional arrangement sustained more by habit, shared history, and mutual convenience than by any remaining romantic connection. A pattern common enough in long marriages generally, but rendered uniquely disturbing in this instance by the sheer scale of the crimes being organised alongside the correspondence's steadily cooling tone. Karl Wolff, Himmler's chief of personal staff and one of the most senior SS officers in the Reichsführer's inner circle, maintained his own periodic contact with the Himmler household throughout these years, and Margarete's diary records his visits, along with those of other senior SS figures passing through Bavaria, on official business, as occasions requiring particular attention to household presentation and hospitality. These visits were never purely social. Himmler's absence meant that Margarete frequently found herself serving as an informal hostess for men who held enormous institutional power within the SS hierarchy, a role that required her to navigate the same delicate social calculations that any political spouse might recognize, offering appropriate hospitality while carefully avoiding any appearance of overstepping into her husband's professional domain. It was a peculiar kind of labour, distinct from the physical work of gardening or animal husbandry, but no less demanding in its own way, requiring Margarete to maintain a constant awareness of her position's political sensitivity, even in the most seemingly mundane domestic interactions. By 1943 and into 1944, the war's deteriorating trajectory began to intrude more visibly on daily life at Gmund. Allied bombing campaigns, though concentrated primarily on major industrial and urban centres, created a pervasive climate of anxiety that touched even relatively remote communities, like the Tegernsee Valley. Margarete's diary from this period increasingly registers concerns about air raid warnings, about the availability of basic goods, and about the well-being of relatives serving at the front or working in increasingly precarious administrative positions as the German war machine began to buckle under the pressure of a two-front war. Her Red Cross duties, meanwhile, would have brought her into direct contact with the mounting human cost of that collapse. Wounded soldiers returning from increasingly catastrophic engagements on the Eastern Front, hospital facilities stretched far beyond their intended capacity, and the slow, grinding realization, shared by millions of ordinary Germans by this point in the war, that the confident predictions of total victory offered by the regime's propaganda machine bore less and less resemblance to the grim reality unfolding on every front. Gudrun's own adolescence during these middle war years deserves closer attention, since her mother's parenting choices during this period would shape the trajectory of the rest of both their lives. As a teenager, Gudrun was enrolled in the Bund Deutscher Mädel, the League of German Girls, the female counterpart to the Hitler Youth, an organisation that combined physical training, ideological indoctrination, and domestic skills instruction in a curriculum explicitly designed to prepare young German women for their expected roles as mothers and homemakers within the racial state. Margarete appears to have wholeheartedly supported her daughter's participation in this programme. An unsurprising stance given how closely the organisation's stated values, discipline, self-sufficiency, devotion to the national community mirrored the domestic philosophy Margarete herself had practiced at Gmund for over a decade. For Gudrun, growing up as the daughter of the Reichsführer SS while enrolled in an organisation that idolised figures exactly like her father created a uniquely reinforcing environment, one in which every institutional and familial signal she received pointed toward the same conclusion, that her father was a hero, that the SS represented the noblest expression of German values, and that any suggestion otherwise could only be enemy propaganda. Margarete's daily parenting choices, however mundane they may have seemed at the time, letters encouraging Gudrun's schoolwork, approval of her league activities, careful cultivation of her relationship with her frequently absent father, were quietly constructing the ideological foundation that would define Gudrun's entire adult life and would eventually make her one of the most stubbornly unrepentant defenders of the Nazi legacy anywhere in post-war Germany. And yet, even amid this mounting crisis, Margarete's diary retains its essentially domestic character, its focus on the immediate and the practical, rather than the strategic or the moral. There is little evidence in the surviving record that she engaged in any serious reflection on the trajectory of the war, on the scale of the atrocities being committed under her husband's authority, or on the moral implications of her own institutional role within the Red Cross apparatus. What we see instead, again and again, is a woman narrowly focused on the preservation of her own household, her own daughter, and her own sense of order in a world that was rapidly spiralling beyond anyone's control, including, ultimately, her husband's. There are a handful of lesser-known details from this period worth pausing on, because they help fill out the texture of Margaret's daily existence in ways that broader historical summaries often skip past. She kept, alongside her diary, a household expenses ledger, a meticulous record of the family's spending that survived the war, along with a recipe book filled with dishes she had either invented herself or clipped from newspapers and copied out by hand. Evidence of a woman who approached even the most mundane aspects of domestic life with the same disciplined thoroughness she brought to her Red Cross administrative duties. She and Heinrich also kept what might be called a baby journal, documenting Gudrun's early development, a sentimental keepsake that traced the milestones of their daughter's first years with the same careful attention that Himmler, in his professional capacity, brought to the bureaucratic documentation of mass murder, an equivalent so grotesque that it barely needs pointing out. Margaret's diary entries about Gudrun record the anxious, ordinary preoccupations of any mother. Worry over a childhood illness, pride at a school achievement, amusement at some precocious remark her daughter had made about the adults around her, including, on one occasion, a worried question from young Gudrun about whether Uncle Hitler would ever die, a phrase that captures with unsettling clarity just how completely the Nazi leadership had inserted itself into even the most intimate corners of this family's domestic imagination. How did Margarete reconcile the affectionate, domestic tone of her husband's letters with the reality of what he was doing in his professional capacity? The honest answer is that the surviving documents give us no evidence that she ever felt compelled to reconcile the two at all. This is, in many ways, the most disturbing lesson embedded in the entire record of her daily life. Not that she was a monster in any conventional sense, but that she experienced no apparent tension between tending her garden, worrying over her daughter's homework, and receiving casual mentions of Auschwitz in her husband's letters home. The banality that Hannah Arendt would later famously attribute to Adolf Eichmann finds an equally chilling domestic counterpart in Margarete Himmler's diary, a document almost entirely free of moral reflection, filled instead with the small, recurring concerns of an ordinary household, even as that household's patriarch presided over an industrialized system of murder. As 1944 gave way to the catastrophic final months of the war, the rhythms of daily life at Gmund began, inevitably, to fray. Supplies grew scarcer still. The threat of advancing Allied armies, both from the west and increasingly from the east, became impossible to ignore, even in the relative shelter of the Bavarian mountains. Margaret's Red Cross duties would have consumed an ever larger share of her time as German hospitals struggled to cope with the flood of wounded soldiers and displaced civilians streaming westward ahead of the advancing Red Army. Her correspondence with Heinrich grew more sporadic as his own responsibilities multiplied chaotically in the war's final phase, when he was simultaneously overseeing the collapsing Eastern Front, conducting secret and ultimately futile negotiations with the Western Allies in a desperate bid to save his own position, and still, remarkably, finding moments to write home about ordinary domestic matters even as the entire edifice of the regime he had helped build began to crumble around him. In April 1945, with Allied forces closing in from multiple directions, Heinrich Himmler travelled to Gmund for what would become the final meeting between husband and wife, and between father and daughter. The details of this last visit are sparse, but its significance is unmistakable. It was the last time Margarete would ever see the man she had married 17 years earlier, the man whose career she had subordinated her own professional ambitions to support, and the man whose ideology she had absorbed so thoroughly that it had shaped the vocabulary of her most private thoughts. Whatever was said between them during those final hours at Lindenfecht has not survived in any detailed account, but within days of that meeting, the war that had structured every aspect of Margaret's adult life for the better part of 2 decades would collapse entirely, taking with it not only the regime her husband had served, but the entire domestic world she had spent 17 years painstakingly constructing at Gmund am Tegernsee. In the days following that final meeting with her husband, Margarete Himmler's carefully ordered daily existence disintegrated with astonishing speed. As American and other Allied forces advanced deeper into Bavaria, Margarete and Gudrun fled south, joining the desperate stream of German civilians and officials attempting to stay ahead of the collapsing front. Their route took them toward Italy, and it was in the region around Bolzano in the South Tyrol that American troops caught up with the invasion's human wreckage in May 1945. Margarete and her daughter were arrested there, two more names on an enormous list of Nazi officials, family members and functionaries being swept up by Allied forces in the war's chaotic final weeks. The woman who had spent 17 years managing the minutiae of an SS household now found herself, virtually overnight, reduced to the status of a detained civilian, her fate no longer determined by her own careful daily planning, but by the machinery of Allied occupation and denazification that was only just beginning to take shape. What followed was a grinding, months-long odyssey through the internment camp system that the Allies had established to process the millions of Germans who had, in one capacity or another, been associated with the Nazi regime. Margarete and Gudrun were held in a series of camps across Italy, France, and Germany, a physical and psychological ordeal that Margarete would later describe with evident bitterness as treatment that made her feel as though she and her daughter were being made to atone for what she called the alleged sins of her husband. A phrase that reveals, even in the immediate aftermath of the war's end and the first public revelations of the Holocaust's full scope, just how thoroughly Margarete continued to minimize and deflect any suggestion of her husband's actual crimes. Heinrich Himmler himself would never face trial. Captured by British forces on the 23rd of May 1945 while attempting to travel in disguise, he crushed a concealed cyanide capsule between his teeth on the following day, dying before interrogators could extract any meaningful testimony from him, an ending that left Margarete to face the post-war reckoning entirely alone, without even the grim clarity of a formal verdict against her husband to help her process what had happened. In September 1945, Margarete was formally interrogated by Allied intelligence officers, an encounter whose surviving transcripts offer a fascinating and frustrating window into how she chose to present herself in the immediate aftermath of the regime's collapse. She described her husband as perpetually busy, someone who reported directly to Hitler and who rarely discussed the specifics of his work with her, and she professed near total ignorance of concentration camp operations, characterizing her own knowledge in only the vaguest terms related to his administrative responsibilities. Her interrogators, according to later historical assessment, came away with the impression of a woman possessed of what was described as a small-town mentality, someone whose horizons and preoccupations remained stubbornly narrow and domestic, even when confronted directly with questions about the most consequential crimes of the 20th century. Whether this impression reflected genuine limitation on Margarete's part, or a calculated strategy of self-protection through professed ignorance, is a question historians continue to debate, though her own wartime diary, with its unambiguous eyewitness account of conditions in occupied Poland and its unfiltered anti-Semitic commentary, makes the claim of total ignorance considerably harder to sustain than her interrogation testimony suggested. It is worth comparing Margarete's interrogation strategy to that adopted by other wives of senior Nazi officials facing similar Allied scrutiny in 1945 and 1946, since the pattern she followed was far from unique to her. Emmy Goring, questioned about her husband's vast fortune in looted art and property, similarly professed ignorance of the criminal origins of that wealth, insisting she had simply enjoyed the comfortable lifestyle her husband provided without inquiring too closely into its sources. Lena Heydrich, questioned about the forced labourers on her Bohemian estate, offered a similarly narrow account of her own knowledge and involvement, one that Allied and later Czechoslovak investigators found only partially convincing. Margarete's own claims of ignorance regarding her husband's role in the Holocaust fit this same broader pattern of wives who had spent years benefiting materially from their husbands' positions while constructing, whether consciously or not, an elaborate personal narrative of domestic separation from the criminal machinery those positions actually served. Allied interrogators, working through hundreds of similar cases in the months after the war's end, developed a certain weary skepticism toward this pattern, without always possessing the specific documentary evidence, in Margarete's case, her own diary entries from occupied Poland, that would later allow historians to test these claims of ignorance against the woman's own contemporaneous written record. Margarete and Gudrun were summoned again in the following months, this time to provide testimony connected to the broader Nuremberg trial proceedings that were, by late 1945, beginning to assemble the historical and legal record of Nazi crimes for the entire world to see. Neither woman stood as a defendant. Their appearance was instead as witnesses, called upon to speak to the personal and domestic dimensions of Himmler's life rather than to answer for crimes of their own. Following this testimony, both were detained at an internment facility known as the Flak-Kaserne in Ludwigsburg, a converted anti-aircraft barracks repurposed to house the enormous overflow of individuals swept up in the Allied denazification effort. Because neither Margarete nor Gudrun had been formally accused of any crime, they were eventually released from internment in November 1946, more than a year and a half after their initial arrest in Bolzano, bringing to an end the most physically arduous chapter of Margarete's post-war life, even as the far longer legal and social reckoning was only just beginning. Upon their release, mother and daughter found refuge, at least temporarily, at the Bethel Institution in Bielefeld, a Christian charitable organization with a long history of caring for people with disabilities and other vulnerable populations. The decision by Bethel's leadership to extend shelter to Himmler's widow and daughter was, unsurprisingly, controversial, and it drew public attention almost immediately. On the 4th of June, 1947, a European edition of the New York Herald Tribune ran a story with the pointed headline describing the widow of Heinrich Himmler as living like a gentlewoman, a piece of journalism clearly designed to highlight the uncomfortable disparity between the comparative comfort Margarete had secured for herself and the devastation experienced by millions of the war's actual victims. The story added another layer of public scrutiny to a woman who had spent the previous decade and a half deliberately avoiding public attention, content to remain the quiet, unglamorous administrator of a rural household, while her husband commanded international infamy. The formal machinery of denazification, meanwhile, ground forward with the bureaucratic thoroughness that characterized so much of the Allied occupation's approach to post-war German society. In 1948, a Bielefeld tribunal classified Margarete as a Category 3 offender, a designation reserved for what the denazification system termed lesser offenders, individuals judged to have been implicated in the regime without holding significant personal responsibility for its crimes. Margarete, apparently unsatisfied even with this relatively lenient classification, retained legal counsel in 1950 to contest it, arguing that her early Nazi party membership had been merely nominal and that whatever elevated status she had achieved within the party hierarchy stemmed not from any ideological zeal but from her long, legitimate service with the German Red Cross, dating back to 1914. It was, in its way, a final act of the same self-justifying narrative she had offered her Allied interrogators years earlier, the story of a hard-working, apolitical nurse who happened, through circumstances largely beyond her control, to have married a man who became one of history's great criminals. This appeal produced a mixed result. In 1951, Margarete was reclassified into Category 4, designated a Mitläufer, or fellow traveller, a category understood to encompass those who had gone along with the regime without playing any active or enthusiastic role in its crimes. But the matter did not end there. A separate denazification proceeding, initiated at the instigation of the Bavarian Minister-President Hans Ehard, revived scrutiny of Margarete's case in the British occupation zone, driven in large part by an unresolved dispute over the ownership of the Gmund property itself. The question of whether the house and land that had served as the family's primary residence throughout the Nazi years should properly be considered the ill-gotten gains of a regime profiteer or the legitimate personal property of a private citizen. This second proceeding concluded very differently from the first. At a final hearing held in Munich on the 15th of January 1953, Margarete was reclassified once again, this time placed into Category 2, the category reserved for activists, militants and profiteers, individuals judged to have derived substantial personal benefit from their association with the Nazi regime. The sentence handed down was 30 days of special labour, along with the forfeiture of her pension rights and her right to vote, a modest legal punishment by almost any measure when weighed against the scale of the regime her household had served, but a punishment nonetheless, and one that formally, finally, closed the book on more than 7 years of legal wrangling over exactly how culpable Margarete. Himmler should be considered for a marriage and a domestic life built entirely within the machinery of the Third Reich. What did those years of legal limbo actually feel like day to day for a woman accustomed to running her own household with total authority? The surviving record suggests a life of diminished circumstances and constant uncertainty, punctuated by legal consultations, hearings, and the slow, grinding paperwork of a bureaucratic process that took the better part of a decade to fully resolve. Gone were the vegetable gardens and the household staff of Gmund. In their place was a much more precarious existence, dependent on the charity of institutions like Bethel and on whatever family support networks remained available to a woman whose name alone was enough to trigger public hostility wherever she went. Gudrun, for her part, left the shelter of Bethel in 1952, striking out on her own even as her mother's legal situation remained unresolved, the beginning of a decades-long trajectory that would eventually see Gudrun become one of the most dedicated and unrepentant defenders of her father's memory anywhere in post-war Germany. Active for decades in organizations that provided support to former SS members and fugitives from justice. Before turning to the internment camps themselves, it is worth pausing on the sheer speed and totality of Margaret's fall from privilege in the spring of 1945, because the contrast helps explain some of the disorientation that colours her later interrogation testimony. In the space of perhaps 6 weeks, Margaret went from presiding over a fully staffed rural estate, complete with gardens, livestock, and the institutional authority of a senior Red Cross official, to being a fugitive fleeing south through a collapsing front line, and finally to being a detained prisoner stripped of every marker of status she had spent 17 years accumulating. Few individuals anywhere in the collapsing Reich experienced quite so complete an inversion of fortune in quite so short a span of time, and it is worth remembering that this experience, however much sympathy it might understandably provoke in isolation, unfolded in the same weeks that Allied forces were liberating concentration camps across German-held territory and confronting the full, unimaginable scale of the crimes that Margaret's own husband had directed. The juxtaposition is jarring by design, a woman experiencing what felt to her like a catastrophic personal loss of status and comfort, occurring at the exact historical moment when the rest of the world was first fully absorbing the scale of the genocide her household had spent over a decade quietly, comfortably supporting. It is worth asking what exactly Margaret's daily existence looked like during those long months of internment between 1945 and 1946, if only because the contrast with her pre-war life at Gmund is so stark that it deserves to be spelled out in some detail. Internment camps for detained Nazi officials and their families were, by most surviving accounts, crowded, Spartan facilities, a far cry from the private villa and household staff Margarete had commanded for over a decade. Days were structured around roll calls, interrogation sessions, and the tedious administrative processing that characterized the Allied denazification bureaucracy in its earliest, most improvised phase. For a woman whose entire adult identity had been organized around exercising domestic authority, the experience of confinement and interrogation represented not merely a physical hardship, but a fundamental inversion of the control she had spent her whole married life cultivating. She was no longer the one issuing instructions to household staff or overseeing hospital administration with the quiet authority of a senior Red Cross official. She was, instead, a detainee, subject to the questions and judgments of Allied officers who had every reason to view her with suspicion, if not outright contempt, given the name she carried and the position her husband had occupied. Gudrun's presence throughout this ordeal appears to have been Margaret's primary source of emotional stability. Mother and daughter moved through the internment system together, were interrogated together, and testified in connection with the Nuremberg proceedings together, a shared experience that deepened the already close bond between them into something that would function, for the rest of both their lives, as each other's most reliable source of loyalty and support. This shared ordeal likely also reinforced the defensive, self-justifying narrative that both women would maintain for the remainder of their lives, the insistence that Heinrich Himmler had been a devoted family man whose professional activities remained entirely separate from his domestic character, and that neither wife nor daughter bore any meaningful responsibility for or even substantial knowledge of the atrocities carried out under his authority. The physical toll of the internment years on Margarete, by this point a woman in her early 50s who had spent the previous 2 decades accustomed to a settled domestic routine, should not be understated either. Camp conditions in the immediate post-war period were frequently Spartan even for detainees who, like Margarete, were never charged with any crime, and the psychological strain of repeated interrogation, of uncertainty about her own legal fate and that of her daughter, and of watching the world's slow, horrified reckoning with her husband's crimes unfold in newspapers and radio broadcasts she had limited access to, must have compounded whatever physical hardships the camps themselves imposed. It was against this backdrop of genuine personal difficulty that Margarete experienced as real even as it paled beside the suffering her husband's policies had inflicted on millions of others, that she began constructing the defensive narrative of domestic ignorance and political naivety that would characterize her testimony for the remainder of her post-war legal proceedings. Historians examining Margarete's case in the decades since have generally converged on a nuanced but ultimately unflattering assessment. The prominent Himmler biographer Peter Longerich has suggested that Margarete probably did not have direct knowledge of the specific administrative secrets or planned operations that defined her husband's most consequential decisions, a judgment consistent with the compartmentalized need-to-know culture that characterized much of the SC's internal operations, even among the highest-ranking officials' own families. But other historians examining her diary in detail, including Jürgen Matthaus, who published an extensive scholarly analysis of her wartime diary entries, have described her as a thoroughly typical example of ordinary Nazi anti-Semitism, someone who wanted, in the simplest and most direct sense, for Jews to disappear from German life, and who benefited materially and socially from a regime built around achieving exactly that goal, regardless of how carefully she tried to distance herself from its operational details in the years after the war. The tension between these two assessments, ignorance of specific operational secrets on the one hand, and deep, self-evident ideological complicity on the other, captures something essential about how historians have come to understand the culpability of Nazi wives more broadly. Not as active perpetrators in the manner of their husbands, but as willing beneficiaries and ideological participants in a system whose crimes they were, at minimum, positioned to see and to at least partially understand, whether or not they held any formal role in planning or executing those crimes themselves. The denazification proceedings that stretched across nearly a decade of Margarete's post-war life also reveal something important about how post-war German society itself struggled to categorize the wives of senior Nazi officials. Was Margarete Himmler a perpetrator, a bystander, or something in between? The shifting classifications she received, from lesser offender in 1948 to fellow traveller in 1951 to activist and profiteer in 1953, reflect not merely the specifics of her individual case, but the broader uncertainty and inconsistency that plagued the entire denazification process as different tribunals, operating under different occupation zones and different political pressures, wrestled with how to assign responsibility for a regime whose crimes had depended on the participation, complicity, and silent acquiescence of millions of ordinary Germans, not merely the small circle of senior officials who stood trial at Nuremberg. Margarete's case, precisely because of her husband's notoriety, became something of a touchstone for these broader debates, a high-profile test of just how much responsibility should be assigned to the domestic partners of history's worst perpetrators. The property dispute that helped trigger Margarete's ultimate reclassification in 1953 deserves a closer look, because it illustrates just how directly the material comforts of her pre-war daily life at Gmund had depended on the plunder and privilege that flowed from her husband's position. The Lindenfecht estate had been acquired during the years of Nazi rule under circumstances that Bavarian authorities, examining the matter in the post-war period, increasingly viewed with suspicion, part of a broader pattern in which senior party and SS officials had acquired valuable property at favourable terms unavailable to ordinary German citizens and often connected, directly or indirectly, to the confiscation of assets from Jewish owners and other victims of the regime across occupied Europe. For Margarete, who had spent nearly 2 decades treating Gmund as her rightful home, the family's principal sanctuary from the pressures of her husband's public role, the prospect of losing legal claim to the property represented a final, painful severing of the last tangible link to the domestic life she had spent so much energy constructing. Her legal team argued, unsuccessfully in the end, that the property had been purchased through legitimate means, and that Margarete's personal conduct, focused as it had been on household management rather than political activity, did not rise to the level of profiteering that the tribunal ultimately found against her. Margarete's own testimony throughout these years, whether before Allied interrogators, Nuremberg investigators, or German denazification tribunals, followed a remarkably consistent pattern that tells us as much about her daily psychology as any diary entry from the pre-war years. She positioned herself, again and again, as a woman defined primarily by domestic and professional identities that predated and, in her telling, existed largely apart from the Nazi regime. A trained nurse, a Red Cross administrator, a devoted wife and mother whose husband's career had simply carried her along in its wake without her full understanding or consent. This narrative was not entirely fabricated. Margarete genuinely had trained as a nurse before ever meeting Heinrich Himmler, and her Red Cross service was genuinely built on decades of accumulated professional experience rather than pure political patronage. But the narrative also required Margarete to suppress or minimize a substantial body of contrary evidence. Her own party membership dating to 1928, her own documented anti-Semitic commentary stretching back to her earliest surviving letters, her own eyewitness observations in occupied Poland, and her own decision to remain married to, and materially dependent upon, a man whose responsibility for the Holocaust was, by the time of her post-war testimony, already becoming a matter of established historical record. It is worth taking a moment to explain the broader denazification framework within which Margarete's case unfolded, since the shifting categories she moved through over the better part of a decade can otherwise seem bewilderingly arbitrary. The Allied occupation authorities, faced with the staggering task of assessing the culpability of an entire nation's population for its participation in the Nazi regime, eventually settled on a 5-tier classification system. Category 1 was reserved for major offenders, the architects and enthusiastic executors of the regime's worst crimes, individuals subject to the harshest penalties available. Category 2 covered activists, militants, and profiteers, those judged to have derived substantial benefit from the regime or to have actively promoted its aims without rising to the level of major offender. Category 3 encompassed lesser offenders. Category 4 covered fellow travellers, the broad mass of Germans who had gone along with the regime without particular zeal, and Category 5 was reserved for those exonerated entirely. Margarete's journey through this system, moving from Category 3 to Category 4 and finally landing at Category 2, traces almost the entire spectrum of possible outcomes, a reflection of just how genuinely contested her case was among different tribunals operating in different zones with different evidentiary standards and different political pressures bearing down on their decisions. Few individual cases illustrate the fundamental instability and inconsistency of the denazification process quite as vividly as Margarete's own decade-long odyssey through it. The Bethel institution that sheltered Margarete and Gudrun in the immediate post-war period carries its own complicated history worth noting here, a history that adds an unsettling irony to its willingness to house Himmler's family. Bethel had, since the 19th century, operated as one of Germany's most significant charitable institutions, caring for people with epilepsy, intellectual disabilities, and other conditions, and during the Nazi era it had become a focal point of resistance, however partial and compromised, to the regime's euthanasia program targeting people with disabilities, a program that Himmler's own SS apparatus had helped implement elsewhere in Germany with horrifying thoroughness. That an institution with this particular history, one that had fought, imperfectly but genuinely, against a euthanasia program connected to the same SS structure Himmler had commanded, would later extend charitable shelter to his widow and daughter speaks to the genuinely tangled, contradictory character of post-war German society's efforts to reckon with individual culpability, mercy, and complicity all at once, often within the same institutions and sometimes within the very same charitable impulse. The Flak Kaserne internment facility at Ludwigsburg, where Margarete and Gudrun were held, also carries a certain historical irony worth mentioning, since the town of Ludwigsburg would later become home to the central office of the State Justice Administrations for the Investigation of National Socialist Crimes, the German institution established in 1958 specifically to coordinate the investigation and prosecution of Nazi war crimes across the country. An office that would spend the following decades painstakingly documenting exactly the kind of systemic atrocities that Margarete's own husband had helped orchestrate. The same small Bavarian town that briefly housed Himmler's wife and daughter as internees in the immediate aftermath of the war would go on to become, within little more than a decade, one of the central engines of Germany's long, difficult post-war effort to prosecute the perpetrators of the Holocaust, a coincidence of geography that underscores just how thoroughly the reckoning with Nazi crimes came to permeate even the most unassuming corners of post-war German civic life. Gerhard von der Ahe's own wartime trajectory offers a small but telling coda to Margaret's story during this same period. Adopted into the household in 1933 as a young boy following his biological father's death, Gerhard had grown up very much in the shadow of Gudrun, receiving considerably less of Himmler's attention and affection than his adoptive sister, a dynamic that several accounts suggest left him feeling like a secondary figure within the family's emotional life, even as he shared its material comforts and its daily routines at Gmund. As the war reached its catastrophic final phase, Gerhard, like so many German youths of his generation, was drawn into the SS, joining its ranks during the chaotic final months of the conflict before being captured by advancing Soviet forces. His subsequent decade in Soviet captivity, a fate shared by hundreds of thousands of German prisoners of war held under often brutal conditions in the Soviet Union's vast prison camp system, meant that Margarete spent the first 10 years of her own post-war reckoning without any contact with her adopted son at all, adding yet another layer of uncertainty and loss to a period already defined by internment, interrogation, and the slow, grinding process of denazification. His eventual release and return to Germany in 1955 allowed Margarete to reconstitute, however partially, the household she had once presided over at Gmund, even if the setting had shrunk from a lakeside villa to a modest shared home in Ypern. After the final denazification hearing in January 1953, Margarete Himmler set about constructing what remained of her life largely away from public view, adopting in various contexts the surname Boden, her maiden name, in an evident attempt to distance herself from the notoriety that the Himmler name still carried more than 7 years after the war's end. This was not a dramatic disappearance into hiding of the kind associated with fugitive SS officers who fled to South America along the post-war rat lines. Margarete remained in Germany, remained in contact with family, and remained, in her own quiet way, unrepentant about the core convictions that had shaped her adult life, even as she sought to minimize the practical inconveniences that came with being publicly identified as the widow of one of history's most notorious mass murderers. From the autumn of 1955, she moved in with her sister Lydia in the town of Ypern, near Bielefeld, a modest domestic arrangement that stood in obvious contrast to the substantial rural estate she had once commanded. And it was there that Gerhard, newly released from Soviet captivity that same year, rejoined her, reconstituting, in however diminished a form, something resembling the family unit she had spent the 1930s building at Gmund. What did Margaret's daily life look like during these quiet later years in Ypern? The honest answer is that the historical record grows considerably thinner here than for any other period of her life, a natural consequence of a woman who had spent nearly a decade fighting to escape public attention, finally succeeding in doing so. We know that she lived modestly, shorn of her pension rights and the material comforts that had once defined her existence at Gmund. We know that she maintained close contact with Gudrun, who by this point had embarked on her own long post-war career as a devoted keeper of her father's memory, eventually becoming deeply involved with an organization called Stille Hilfe, meaning silent help, a secretive network that provided material and legal assistance to former SS members who had been arrested, convicted, or were fleeing prosecution for war crimes. We know that Margaret's final years were spent living with Gudrun in Munich, the two women maintaining until the very end the same close, mutually reinforcing bond that had carried them through internment, interrogation, and years of legal uncertainty in the aftermath of the war. Beyond these broad outlines, the day-to-day texture of Margaret's life in this period remains largely undocumented. A private old age lived out by a woman who had spent decades as the quiet, unglamorous administrative centre of one of history's most notorious households, and who seems to have wanted nothing more in her final years than to be left alone. Gudrun's involvement with Stille Hilfe deserves a somewhat fuller account here, since it illustrates just how directly the ideological world Margarete had helped construct at Gmund continued to shape the family's actions for decades after the war's end. Stille Hilfe, founded in the early 1950s, operated as a discreet support network providing financial assistance, legal representation, and in some cases logistical help to former SS members facing prosecution, imprisonment, or the threat of extradition for war crimes. Gudrun's decades of work with the organization placed her in direct contact with unrepentant perpetrators of the Holocaust well into the late 20th century. Work she pursued with an unwavering conviction that her father, and by extension the broader SS apparatus he had commanded, had been unjustly maligned by history. Margaret's own role in shaping this conviction cannot be measured with precision, since she died in 1967 with Gudrun's activism still in its relatively early phases. But the ideological continuity between mother and daughter, forged across decades of shared interment, shared testimony, and shared domestic life at Gmund, is impossible to overlook. Whatever Margarete did or did not directly teach her daughter about politics, she succeeded, whether by design or simple proximity, in raising a child whose devotion to Heinrich Himmler's memory would prove durable enough to survive the fall of the Third Reich by more than 70 years. Margarete Himmler died on the 25th of August, 1967, in Munich, at the age of 73. The available record points to natural causes rather than any dramatic circumstance, a quiet ending entirely in keeping with the deliberately low profile she had cultivated throughout the post-war decades. She died, by every indication, without ever expressing public remorse for her party membership, her anti-Semitic convictions, or her decades of material and emotional support for a husband whose crimes had by then been documented in exhaustive historical and legal detail. Gudrun, who outlived her mother by more than 5 decades, continued to defend her father's reputation with unwavering intensity until her own death in 2018, remaining active in far-right causes and organisations well into old age, a living continuation of the ideological world that Margaret had helped construct within the walls of the Gmund household so many decades earlier. Before turning to that final, remarkable chapter, it is worth sitting for a moment with the specific quiet of Margaret's last 14 years, because it stands in such deliberate contrast to everything that came before it. This was a woman who had spent nearly 2 decades at the administrative centre of one of the most consequential households in modern history, a woman whose signature appeared on Red Cross hospital reports, whose diary recorded eyewitness observations of occupied Poland, whose social calendar had once included the wives of the SS's most feared officers. By the late 1950s and into the 1960s, that entire world had been reduced to a small household in Heepen and later Munich, a life of pensions denied, voting rights stripped, and a name that, whenever it surfaced in public, invited scrutiny and condemnation rather than the deference she had once taken for granted as the Reichsführer's wife. Margarete appears to have accepted this diminishment without any recorded protest beyond the legal appeals she had already exhausted by 1953. She settled instead into the same pattern of quiet domestic industry that had defined her entire adult life, simply on a much smaller and more constrained scale, tending whatever garden she had access to, managing whatever household she found herself part of, and maintaining, above all, her relationships with Gudrun and Gerhard, the 2 children whose lives she had shaped so thoroughly during the Gmund years and who remained, until her death, the emotional centre of whatever daily purpose she still carried. There is, however, one final chapter to Margaret's story that unfolded entirely after her death, and it is perhaps the most remarkable twist in the entire account of what she did and what she left behind during her decades as Heinrich Himmler's wife. At the war's end, as American troops overran the family's abandoned house at Gmund, 4 soldiers discovered a substantial cache of documents locked in a safe, hundreds of letters exchanged between Heinrich and Margarete over nearly 2 decades, personal diaries kept by both Margarete and Gudrun, a baby journal documenting Gudrun's earliest years, family photograph albums, the household expense ledger, and even Margaret's handwritten recipe book. Rather than turning this extraordinary trove over to military authorities as regulations required, the 4 soldiers divided the collection between themselves, splitting it into 2 chronological groups. One portion, covering documents from 1910 through 1926, eventually made its way to an American intelligence officer in exchange for a bottle of whiskey, and from there passed through several hands before landing at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University, where scholars eventually used it as the basis for a published historical study of Himmler's early life. The second, larger portion of the collection, covering the crucial years from 1927 through 1945, essentially vanished from public knowledge for decades. It resurfaced only in the 1960s, purchased under murky and still not entirely clarified circumstances by an Israeli cultural affairs officer and painter named Chaim Rosenthal, who told varying and inconsistent stories over the years about exactly how he had acquired the material, at one point claiming he had bought it at a flea market in Brussels, at another point claiming a purchase from a former Nazi officer living in Mexico for a considerable sum of money. For decades, the collection sat largely unknown in Rosenthal's Tel Aviv apartment, its existence unsuspected by historians until it was eventually rediscovered and authenticated, leading to its serialized publication in the German newspaper Die Welt in early 2014, 69 years after Himmler's capture and suicide, followed by a full scholarly edition assembled by Himmler's own great-niece Katrin Himmler, working alongside the historian Michael Wilt, published in English under the title The Private Heinrich Himmler, and offering for the first time a comprehensive public account of the very letters and diary entries that make it possible to reconstruct, in such granular detail, exactly what Margarete Himmler did with her days. The scholars who examined this material were unanimous in describing it as unlike anything else that survives from the Nazi leadership's inner circle. Where Joseph Goebbels left behind extensive diaries, those diaries were understood from the outset to have been written, at least in part, with an eye toward posterity and propaganda, a curated self-portrait rather than an unguarded private record. The Himmler correspondence, by contrast, was never intended for any audience beyond its two correspondents, which makes its banality all the more historically valuable and all the more disturbing. Here was a mass murderer writing home about caviar in the icebox and his daughter's Christmas wish list in between organising the machinery of genocide, and here was his wife responding in kind, filling page after page with the mundane concerns of household management, while occasionally, almost incidentally, revealing the depth of her own ideological commitment to the very system her husband was helping to build. The Israeli filmmaker Vanessa Lapper would go on to build an entire documentary, titled The Decent One, using nothing but voiceover readings of this correspondence layered over archival footage, a film that earned serious award consideration precisely because of how effectively it captured the horrifying ordinariness at the heart of the Himmler household's private life. So, after all of this, what did Margarete Himmler actually do all day? She raised chickens and kept a ledger. She dosed her family's minor ailments with herbal tinctures and distrusted modern medicine. She managed a household staff, tended an extensive garden, and organised social functions for women she did not particularly like and who did not particularly like her. She wrote thousands of pages of letters and diary entries recording the weather, her daughter's schoolwork, and her own casual, unreflective hatred of Jewish people, all in the same flat domestic register. She travelled into occupied Poland as a Red Cross official and recorded what she saw there in terms of contempt rather than horror. She tolerated her husband's secret second family for the sake of preserving her daughter's relationship with her father. She fled her home as the war collapsed, was captured, interrogated, and interned, and spent nearly a decade afterward fighting a series of denazification tribunals over exactly how much responsibility she bore for a regime she insisted, against considerable contrary evidence, she had barely understood. And in the end she died quietly, unrepentant, in the company of a daughter who would spend the rest of her own long life defending the very legacy that Margaret's own diary had helped to document in such damning, mundane detail. It is worth drawing out the contrast between the Himmler correspondence and the diaries of Joseph Goebbels a little further, because it sharpens exactly what makes Margaret's documentary legacy so historically significant. Goebbels, as the regime's propaganda chief, understood better than almost anyone else in the Nazi hierarchy the power of the curated record, and his diaries, extensive as they are, must always be read with the awareness that their author expected them, eventually, to be read by someone, whether contemporaries or posterity, and shaped his entries accordingly, softening some passages, dramatising others, always performing a version of himself for an imagined future audience. Margarete Himmler harboured no such expectation. Her diary was a private tool for managing an already overwhelming domestic workload, a place to jot down the day's weather, the state of the garden, a visiting relative's arrival time, and, intermixed with all of that, the casual prejudices she had absorbed so completely that she never thought to censor them even in a document meant for her eyes alone. This is precisely what gives the Himmler correspondence its unique and disturbing value to historians. It captures, with none of the self-conscious posturing that colours so many other Nazi-era records, exactly how ordinary, how administratively banal complicity in an unprecedented atrocity could actually feel from the inside, for the person managing the household budget rather than the person managing the concentration camps. Scholars examining this material have repeatedly returned to the question of what Margaret's diary and letters can and cannot tell us about the broader phenomenon of female complicity within the Nazi regime. Unlike the small number of women who held direct operational roles within the concentration camp system, guards like Irma Grise or Maria, Mandel, whose crimes involved direct physical violence against prisoners, Margaret's complicity operated at an entirely different register: material, social, and ideological, rather than physically violent. She never struck a prisoner, never selected anyone for the gas chamber, never wore an SS uniform in any operational capacity. And yet her decades of unwavering support, both material and emotional, for a husband she knew to be deeply and personally involved in the machinery of extermination, her own casually expressed wish that the Jewish population would simply disappear, and her own eyewitness presence in occupied Poland during the earliest, most brutal phase of German occupation policy, together sketch a portrait of complicity that resists any comfortable distinction between guilty perpetrators and innocent bystanders. She occupied instead the vast and uncomfortable middle ground where most of the Third Reich's civilian population actually lived, neither pulling any trigger themselves nor entirely ignorant of what was being done in their name, but rather willing, comfortable beneficiaries of a system whose crimes they preferred not to examine too closely, so long as the household accounts balanced and the garden continued to bloom each spring. The story of Margarete Himmler resists the kind of simple moral categorization that documentary storytelling often reaches for. She was not a camp guard. She was not present at any of the killing sites where her husband's orders were carried out. By the standards applied at Nuremberg, she was never even considered a viable defendant, let alone a convicted war criminal. And yet the sheer ordinariness of her complicity, the way genocide could sit alongside grocery lists and garden notes without apparently disturbing her conscience in any recorded way, offers one of the starkest illustrations available anywhere in the historical record of how thoroughly an entire domestic sphere could be absorbed into the machinery of an atrocity without a single overtly criminal act being required of the person managing that sphere. Margarete Himmler's case exemplifies the deep and unresolved complexity of post-war accountability, where a woman's proximity to unimaginable crimes could be measured in letters about caviar and diary entries about the weather, and where the legal system ultimately settled, after nearly a decade of deliberation, on 30 days of penal labour as the sum total of her formal punishment. The academic and journalistic reception of the letters when they finally reached the public in 2014 offers its own instructive coda to Margaret's story. Die Welt's decision to serialize the material across 8 installments, complete with family photographs many readers had never seen, generated substantial international press coverage, with outlets across Europe, North America, and Israel picking up the story of a mass murderer's private correspondence emerging, almost impossibly, nearly 7 decades after his death. Commentators seize particularly on the jarring contrast between the domestic banality of the letter's content and the horror of what their author was doing professionally at the time each letter was written, a contrast that became the central organizing theme of nearly every piece of coverage the discovery generated. The subsequent English-language publication of the full scholarly edition, with careful annotation and historical context provided by Michael Wilt, allowed researchers and general readers alike to move beyond the sensational newspaper excerpts and engage with the fuller scope of the correspondence, tracing its arc from the playful, infatuated letters of the late 1920s courtship through the terse, distracted notes of the war's final catastrophic months. For Katrin Himmler, the great niece of both Heinrich and Margarete, who took on the difficult task of editing this material for publication, the project carried a particular personal weight. Katrin had already spent years grappling publicly with her own family's Nazi history, having published an earlier book examining her grandfather and great-uncles, and her decision to helm the editorial project behind the Himmler letters reflected a broader commitment within some branches of the extended Himmler family to confront rather than obscure the historical record, a commitment that stood in stark and deliberate contrast to Gudrun's lifelong project of denial and rehabilitation. The existence of these two radically opposed responses within the same extended family, one grandniece meticulously annotating and publishing the evidence of her ancestors' crimes for historical clarity, the other spending decades defending those same ancestors and providing material support to their unrepentant subordinates, illustrates just how contested and unresolved the legacy of figures like Margarete and Heinrich Himmler has remained across succeeding generations of German society. The documentary film built from this material, The Decent One, released in 2014 under the direction of the Israeli filmmaker Vanessa Lapper, took a particularly bold, formal approach, refusing to include any conventional historian interviews or narration, and relying instead entirely on voice actors reading the letters and diary entries aloud over carefully restored archival footage. This structural choice forced audiences to sit with the material's own words without the customary interpretive framing that most historical documentaries provide, an approach that critics widely praised for its unsettling, immersive power precisely because it denied viewers the comfort of an authoritative narrator explaining how they ought to feel about what they were hearing. The film's title itself, drawn from a phrase used ironically to describe Himmler's own self-image as a supposedly decent, dutiful family man even as he organized mass murder, captures the central paradox that Margaret's own life and correspondence so thoroughly illustrate: the capacity of ordinary domestic virtue, tending a garden, writing loving letters to a daughter, managing a household budget, to coexist without apparent internal conflict alongside knowing participation in and material benefit from history's most notorious program of genocide. It is worth returning, in closing, to the question posed at the very start of this video. What did Margarete Himmler actually do all day? The answer, pieced together across nearly 4 decades of surviving letters, diary entries, interrogation transcripts, and denazification records, turns out to be almost defiantly ordinary. She raised chickens. She wrote to her sisters. She worried about her daughter's schoolwork and her husband's health. She practiced homeopathy and distrusted modern medicine. She organized luncheons she did not particularly enjoy for women who did not particularly like her. She kept meticulous household accounts and clipped recipes from newspapers, and interwoven through every single one of these ordinary activities without apparent friction or hesitation, ran a current of casual, unreflective anti-Semitism and unwavering loyalty to a man she knew, at some level that her own diary makes impossible to fully deny, was helping to orchestrate the extermination of millions of human beings. That combination, the seamless coexistence of domestic banality and genocidal complicity, is precisely why her story continues to matter more than 7 decades after her death. Not because Margarete Himmler herself wielded any significant power, but because her diary offers one of history's clearest windows into how comfortably an ordinary life could be built, brick by brick, letter by letter, garden row by garden row, directly on top of an atrocity. Historians studying the broader phenomenon of the Nazi home front have increasingly turned to figures like Margarete precisely because her documentary record is so unusually complete, allowing for a kind of granular reconstruction of daily complicity that remains impossible for almost any other family within the senior Nazi leadership. Where most historical accounts of the Holocaust necessarily focus on decision-making at the level of policy, on the deportation orders, the camp construction schedules, and the bureaucratic machinery of mass murder, Margaret's diary offers something rarer and in some ways more unsettling: a ground-level view of what it actually felt like to be married to the machinery's chief architect, to receive his letters, to manage his household, to raise his children, and to go on doing so, day after day, year after year, without ever apparently pausing to reckon with the moral weight of what that household's comfort and order actually depended upon. It is a story without heroism, without dramatic confrontation, and largely without even conscious villainy in the operational sense. It is instead a story about how thoroughly the ordinary rhythms of domestic life, the garden, the ledger, the letters home, could absorb and normalize even the most extraordinary evil, so long as no one in the household ever stopped to ask too many questions about where the comfort was actually coming from. The broader field of historical scholarship on women in the Third Reich has, over the past several decades, moved considerably beyond the older assumption that Nazi wives and mothers were simply passive bystanders to their husbands' crimes, insulated by domesticity from any meaningful complicity in the regime's atrocities. Historians such as Claudia Kuhns, whose influential study of women in Nazi Germany reshaped scholarly understanding of the so-called private sphere under fascism, have argued persuasively that the domestic world Margarete Himmler inhabited was never actually separate from the machinery of persecution and genocide, but rather functioned as an essential support structure for it, providing the emotional stability, the ideological reinforcement, and the everyday normalization that allowed men like Heinrich Himmler to compartmentalize their professional crimes from their private lives with such apparent ease. Margaret's own diary, with its unself-conscious blending of garden notes and genocidal wishes, stands as perhaps the single clearest piece of documentary evidence supporting this reinterpretation, offering scholars an unusually direct window into exactly how that domestic support structure actually operated on a day-to-day basis, entry by entry, letter by letter, across nearly 2 decades of marriage. This reassessment carries implications that extend well beyond Margaret's individual case, prompting broader questions about how societies ought to understand and assign responsibility within family units that benefit from, participate in, and quietly sustain systems of organized violence, questions that remain distressingly relevant to societies grappling with mass atrocity and complicity in the present day, long after the last participants in the Nazi regime itself have died. Margarete Himmler was never a policymaker, never a camp guard, never present at any killing site, and by the narrow legal standards applied at Nuremberg, she committed no prosecutable crime beyond her eventual classification as a regime profiteer. And yet her diary demonstrates with an evidentiary clarity that few other sources from this period can match that the machinery of genocide depended not only on the relatively small number of men who gave direct orders and pulled triggers, but on a much larger supporting cast of wives, mothers, and household managers whose daily labour, comfort, and quiet ideological conviction helped make that machinery function smoothly, day after ordinary day, for as long as the regime that built it endured. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this deep dive into the daily life of Margarete Himmler informative. If you enjoyed learning about the private world behind the public face of the Third Reich, make sure to check out our video on what happened to the wives of Nazi leaders after World War II, where you'll find out how Margarete's story compares to that of women like Emmy Goring and Lena Heydrich, and our video on what happened to the children of Nazi leaders after World War II, which follows her daughter Gudrun's own remarkable and unsettling post-war path. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more World War II content. See you in the next one.